Hello, welcome back. Thank you for joining us once more. So now we have our fourth panel of the day, which is energy and politics, who is ruling the roost? And we're going to be discussing who should break the stalemate between these faceless institutions first, how we can do this, and who should be doing this. This will be moderated by Divya, and please welcome her and her four esteemed colleagues to the stage. Give them a massive round of applause.
Yes. Sorry. No, I don't know where to sit.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Everyone hear me okay?
That's it.
That is four of us.
So good afternoon. It's a bit sunny, but I hope everybody is having a good COP so far. And I think it's going to be an exciting conversation here. So I'm Divya. I'm with Global Choices. I've probably spent quite a bit of time in energy policy to be able to have this conversation. And I'm really excited to have Charles, Chris, Rob, and Nasha here. Everyone bringing some diverse perspectives to this conversation, talking about energy versus policy. So maybe I'll start the conversation with you, Charles, and I'll introduce him first. So Charles Perry is the founder at Sustainable Future for All. He's a well-known sustainable business and climate leader with 25 years of commercial experience embedding sustainability into the DNA of many large multinationals, as well as building several purpose-driven businesses as a green entrepreneur himself. He was the founder director of BP Green Energy. He was managing director of both Good Energy and Second Nature, and I haven't even finished. The list is so long. He was also director of Antithesis, acquirer of his company, co-founder of GridServe, and now founder of Sustainable Future for All. He also played a key role on the UN COP26 Climate Champions team, where he led the global aviation sector to sign up to the Paris Agreement and commit to net zero by 2050. He's an ambassador of Meaningful Business 100, an ambassador for climate and ecology bill, and an Al Gore climate reality leader. That's something we have in common. So Charles, I think it's amazing that we have someone like you here today to give us your perspective in this conversation. You've worked within the energy sector for almost 3 decades trying to greenify the giant oil and gas companies, and then working with the UN Climate Champions. So can you tell us a little bit about this trajectory, like, how you went through this whole process of working with businesses, then moving towards the UN? What has been your experience, and what has the real shift that you've seen within the energy system, as well as how the policy has shaped it? Is the energy sector really pushing itself enough? And of course, what do you think is the real challenge? Is that with policies or with the governments? Or is just the energy sector needs to just step up and really not wait for policies to catch up?
Thank you, Divya. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'd love to pay my respects to Extreme, because this is a pretty amazing venue, and to get this panel together, it's a delight to be part of it. So thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I got into this whole area as a South African who was motivated by wildlife as a young boy, trying to think, well, how do you sort of take your passion for nature and the environment into business? And so, yeah, it has been about 30 years of trying to drive a transition, and we're here to talk about a transition. In South Africa, we talk about the just transition, because, of course, we're trying to maximize societal, economic, and environmental benefits in the just transition, while minimizing the risks and managing that time period, because it doesn't happen overnight. But what I think we all want to see is more urgency, right? So this is a question of human will, because when people come together, we can do great things. I was very inspired, of course, by the great Nelson Mandela. I mean, who wouldn't be, right? I think we all were, everywhere around the world. Because in the 80s in South Africa, when everything looked very dark, who would have thought that, F.W. de Klerk would do a coup of the cabinet, Nelson Mandela was released, and suddenly we have the new South Africa. And we have the first black president of South Africa in a new non-racial rainbow nation. I actually met, you mentioned the Vice President, Al Gore, at President Mandela's inauguration when I was a young person, like some of you in the audience. And I had no idea when I met him that he was an environmentalist who had already written a book called Earth in the Balance. So I was just working in the amphitheater on that day, was such a great day. The US delegation was led by First Lady Hillary Clinton with Vice President Al Gore and his wife. And I was making sure they were happy, taking them to their seats, etc. Fast forward, I mean, I was with him last night, as some of you, I mean, you mentioned the climate reality. We had a celebration of climate reality last night. You know, he's probably the longest perseverant, persistent, clearest voice on the challenge. And we all know the challenge is immense. And if you live in different parts of the world, the challenge has different complexities to it, right? So the perspective from the UK is very different from Argentina, for example, where you've now got a new government which seems to be going, in a way, you know, to those who don't know Argentina, in a sort of backwards direction. In the UK, we're also wondering, and Chris, you're going to have a chance to talk about this, is the Prime Minister going in a backwards direction? Because what you look for is leadership. And I mentioned Nelson Mandela, I mentioned Al Gore. Another person I had the benefit of just spending 1 month with in Calcutta as a young backpacker was Mother Teresa. Her commitment, so I learned it's about commitment. And so I think all of us really are trying to do the right thing, because I don't think there's anyone here that disagrees. I quote the COP28 president himself. I mean, here we are hosted by the COP28 president. Just yesterday, he said, we all agree that fossil fuels needs to be phased down and out. It's inevitable, right? That was just yesterday. So if we all agreed with that, then it's very simple. It's just how quickly do we do it, and the dynamics of what the wealthy countries do, because they've benefited for the longest from fossil fuels, but with its external cost of pollution to the rest of the world, how the North, the Western countries, basically helps with the just transition of what we call the global South. You asked about my personal journey. I would just say, you know, I don't want to dwell on that, but I'll just say probably the sort of most interesting bit of it was trying to change BP. So I arrived at BP in the year 2000 as an environmental consultant. I just finished business school. And the idea was, you know, go and change an oil and gas company as a 30-year-old. Now, 6 years at BP, I mean, I have to say, you look at BP now, and you don't really see a huge amount of change from the BP when I was there, even though we tried everything to get a renewable energy business off the ground. We got $8 billion from John Brown and the board to build out renewables and alternatives. But today, BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, other oil and gas companies, they don't seem to have become what I would have liked to have seen them do by now, green energy companies. Mm-hmm. Now, that was sort of my wish, is BP could become, hence the sun, the Helios, BP, beyond petroleum, BP could become a global green energy company. So my challenge really is to, you know, ADNOC and all these other great companies, why can't they become global green energy companies? And when will they become global green energy companies?
Indeed. Yeah, that's the challenge. And I'll come back to you with more questions on that. Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. Okay, so up next, we have the honor of having here with us today Right Honourable Chris Skidmore, who was the UK's Universities and Science Minister between 2018 to 2020. During his time, he published the UK International Education Strategy. He's currently co-chair of all-party group on universities and established the International Higher Education Commission with Oxford International in 2022. Chris was also a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School recently and was appointed a professor at Bath University. He was appointed as the Officer of British Empire, OBE, in the Platinum Jubilee Honours of Queen Elizabeth II. In 2023, he also published the 340-page Mission Zero report for the UK government, having been asked to independently review the UK's net zero strategy, a pledge he signed into law as also the Energy Minister. MP, I will dive right into this. The UK government is actually currently scaling back on key green policies at the central level. While you and the UK 100 have released a report with more than 30 recommendations on how the government can give agency to local authorities to help deliver net zero and focusing on the vital role of local and regional governments. You've said that the future is local. That is great, but what about the energy sector at large? What is the role they play? Maybe just coming from the aspect of the local and regional governments themselves, what is the energy sector supposed to do here? And how can they work with communities on the local energy plans? But of course, lastly, why the impetus on the local authorities? Why are not the central government and energy companies being held more accountable on this?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. And I think it's an important session we're having, particularly at COP28, when we're now focusing on having a global stocktake, judging what progress countries have made so far on the back of their national determined contributions, but also to recognize that we're in this sort of inflection point where we've moved away now from a treaty text that's more or less agreed to a new process of how we effectively implement and deliver for the future, and how we can hold countries accountable for that. And the challenge, I think, now is to recognize, obviously, net zero, and I signed the UK's net zero commitment into law. We're the first G7 country to do so. We beat France by a single day, and the UK is now held legally accountable. It can be sued in the High Court, as the government has been. I think that's an important perspective for creating accountability mechanisms within a specific country to hold governments to account. And we can talk about who should be holding governments to account, because there's various sort of points of contact that you can do that. But ultimately, when it comes to delivering on net zero, if we don't meet our emissions reduction targets of 43% emissions reduction globally by 2030, we're not going to make it. So my frustration, with the UK's government's current position is it's incredibly unfortunate. The UK is still the leader when it comes to emissions reduction. We are the number one G20 nation to have decarbonised 8% of our emissions since 1990 levels, at the same time as growing the economy by 70%. So sort of demonstrating that we're not looking to degrow the economy. We can ensure you have jobs, that we have regeneration, that we have opportunity at the same time as tackling climate change. That's an important narrative, but we want to maintain public support for the energy transition. But I was asked by the UK government to come back and do a report, which I published as a book. It's called Mission Zero, and that sets out 10-year missions for how we can deliver in the UK on net zero by depoliticising a process that shouldn't really be owned by any one political party. The Conservative Party that I'm a member of backed the then Labour Party in committing to a Climate Change Act, which provided the then stable framework for setting carbon budgets, having a committee called the Committee on Climate Change that's properly independent, setting out these carbon budgets, holding government to account. And it's only recently that suddenly my own government's begin to politicise net zero, to sort of look to create a culture war, a dividing line between those who might say, look, we need to be sensible here and plan for a future where we won't be using oil and gas, and therefore it is sensible, I personally believe, to be talking about an end date, a phase-out date, and how to map that out. It's not fair on those communities that are working in high carbon industries such as gas and oil to be sold a false promise that their industries are going to survive when economically they're not going to, when we look at the current trajectories of the decline of oil and gas. But we have had a position now being taken by my own government that is, if you start talking about saying, well, we need to just stop oil and gas, that somehow you're an extremist, that you're a zealot, that you don't have permission or a right to talk about this in a reasonable fashion because you're supposedly being unreasonable. And that's the challenge I think we face both as politicians but as elected leaders, facing both ways. Charles spoke very emotively of obviously the leadership that's been taken by several international leaders from Al Gore right the way through to Nelson Mandela. But how can we make those international commitments that we are devising here at COP real in the communities that we need to go back to make sure that we can deliver? And that's where I think the local agency and regional agency is so important, because actually when you look at cities, some cities are already meeting their net zero commitments. They're on track. And my report showed that if you want to deliver on net zero in a way that's cheaper, that's more efficient, that actually is going to have public support, you've got to do it in a place-based approach. You've got to be able to give cities and regions a sense of hope, but also a sense of opportunity that they can own the transition. I'm a great believer, the more we can push down ownership of climate action and net zero to communities, so they're almost authors of their own net zero stories, the more people we have bought into this process. And that's why local action is so important. It's not just around directly elected officials, important though those are, making sure mayors, local councils take decisions, and not just faceless bureaucrats, whether at Whitehall or Westminster in the UK or in the capital cities in other countries. If we leave it to central government, we will fail. ultimately we have failed in the past. We've had 28 COPs and we've still seen emissions rising. We can't just put our trust in national leaders. It must be those on the ground who can deliver, partly because they know what needs to happen. They can know what the industrial footprint, the housing footprint, the agricultural footprint is in their local area. They can map this out. They can get the blended finance, the private investment that can come in to support their public investment. But ultimately, they're the ones on the ground who see their communities day to day and also the reality of what climate change will mean to those communities. So my sort of focus would be, yes, of course, we need democratic accountability. Don't get me wrong, elected politicians are there for a reason, to take responsibility and to be held account. And we must ensure that climate action, as best possible, is hardwired into the constitutions of countries in the same way that net zero is now hardwired as a legal framework into our statutory legislation in the UK. But we can't stop there. We need to make sure that when it comes to delivery and implementation, it's those on the ground at a local level who are best placed to deliver.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, I think it's first local and then global, right? And I think that's really important. And thank you for that perspective. And I'll now go to, actually, I'll go to Rob. We'll follow the order. So Robert Turner is a partner in the UK Energy Strategy team at PwC and has been an energy sector leader for a long time, now focusing mainly on delivering the energy transition. Rob has been working as an advisor in the energy sector for over 20 years, working across global markets, and actually began his career as a market specialist with PFC Energy, IHS, Schlumberger, and then energy sector strategy with Arthur D. Little. So yeah, broad range of consulting experience there. He leads a team of sector specialists supporting strategy, policy, restructuring work for a broad range of clients. I would say more importantly now, Rob is supporting the World Economic Forum, IBC, in its Transforming Energy Demand Initiative, which will be formally launched with a white paper on the potential for demand-side interventions at the 2024 World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos. Rob, I think it's great to have you here, and now actually I'm interested more that we are now moving the needle a bit from the UK and the private sector to going a bit more global on the theme. Can you please tell us a bit more about this white paper on the potential for demand-side interventions that will be launched? And additionally tell us that why are we putting the onus on the consumers and the demand side? Does this really justify if the energy supply systems that don't adjust radically in the next 5 to 10 years? What is the benefit of such demand-side interventions unless the energy companies take the lead? And why, what role does the government play in this equation? So shouldn't they be actually making massive, aggressive policies for the supply side?
So it's a complicated question. It probably took you about five sentences to get to the question on that one. It's a complicated area. I would say keeping it really practical and really simple. Your question about whether you should move away from the supply side, no, clearly there has to be a massive change on the supply side in the energy system. And a lot of the attention in the debate that we have at COP is around that supply side conversation. Okay? That's an inherent good, it has to happen. But my belief is that that is potentially quite dangerous in setting energy policy. That what you're doing is saying, I've got an energy system which is largely hydrocarbon-based. I'm going to look at the energy companies who are in that system, and I'm going to say what we need to do to get to the net zero targets is decarbonize that and just make it all about that supply re-rigging. Why is that quite dangerous? It's dangerous for two reasons. Firstly, demand is not your friend in that conversation. And secondly, it misses some low-hanging fruit and some real economic value in efficiency. And the last reason is it takes agency away from the wider economy. Okay, and I'll address your question about consumers. So if you look at that set of issues, demand not being your friend, the global economy by 2050 is expected to double. So in GDP terms, you're doubling the size of the global economy. Now, you can have a nice debate about GDP, but a lot of that doubling is, particularly to your point, is that emerging markets needing to hit their development goals. So you've got twice the GDP in 2050. You've also got 2 billion more people expected to be on the Earth in 2050. Now, that trajectory at the moment has got us growing energy demand by over 2.5% a year, and that energy demand is expected to keep growing at 2.5% a year at current levels. Now that in itself is unsustainable. Because if we look at the decarbonisation debate, we're trying to take this current stack of energy and decarbonise all of that. If we let that stack grow by 2.5% a year to 2050, there's absolutely no way we can get there. That puts far too much stress on the system. So to assume it's just a supply-side solution, build more renewables, what about bending that curve down or even pushing it down by getting really big efficiency gains in the economy? Okay, so could that happen? And the point then being, you're expecting the energy system to do all the heavy lifting. Now, what could happen on demand? I come back to the consumer question. A lot of the dialogue with companies and with individuals, I think, is written in, understandably, but moral language. You know, what must happen, what companies should do, how they ought to behave. There's a lot of aspiration and conviction around that, which again, for the avoidance of doubt, I agree with. But in writing this white paper, the challenge I gave to my team was, could you write around energy transition and delivering the energy transition and not use any of that language at all? Not rely on any kind of moral imperative, not rely on any voluntary change. Could we articulate a pathway that would just be economically rational? And the good news is, I think we're at an inflection point where we can assert that we can get to a net zero pathway in an economically rational way. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In the OECD, buildings represent about 30% of our energy consumption. A conservative estimate is that you could reduce that number by about 40% with retrofitting, and that has perfectly good payback. Most plans you do on retrofitting payback assume 7 to 10 years, and in experience, people keep telling me that the payback is better, it's more like 3 to 5 years, right? So if you were to have a program on retrofitting buildings, and that's a lot of stuff in retrofitting, you could be reducing energy demand in that mature economy by 0.4 times 0.3, that's 12% of energy. I'm saying that's technologically entirely feasible. That's got great payback. And that's the kind of thinking I think we should be injecting into the energy transition debate. Helping people see that, helping people consolidate those numbers. Potentially there's some push on policy and otherwise to help it along. But if you can get to those kind of, you're really then asking the world to act rationally and act now and take those numbers out. That, for me, is a different way of approaching the debate, and I find it entirely compelling. So it's shifting the debate away from, I don't think we now need to reframe. I think there's no, we don't have to re-explain why we have these imperatives, but we've got good news technologically, we've got good news economically, and I think there's a really, really feasible plan to attack that big reduction in consumption. So you're not asking consumers to do behavioral stuff, you're then having to mobilize society from policy, from financing, and from industrial strategy to address those elements. You're not then relying on compulsion and voluntary action. You're just saying, act rationally, we can get there.
Awesome. So that basically also means that if the demand side, reduces, the supply side can also be a little more, relaxed, rather than be panicking about meeting those 5 to 10% growth targets.
The point is you're putting huge stress on the system and on the global economy. We've had the global financial crisis. We've got governments with massive debt. If you assume the only way to deliver the energy transition is to build, and start looking at the mega projects, you're putting huge stress on an already stressed system. So a way of reducing that stress is to need to build less by consuming less, but importantly, not consuming less and constraining economic growth and development, just growing more while using less. And less waste in the economy, more efficiency in the economy. And if we can get to that trajectory, which I believe is possible, it really releases a lot more space for us to get to a much more deliverable net zero target.
Indeed, and I think you also talked about the just energy transition in South Africa, reducing coal. That all adds to the demand side initiatives as well. So, okay, so now we go to Nasha. Nasha Cuvelier is from Argentina. I'm so excited to have you here. So, as an environmentalist scientist and activist, I think it's amazing that you have been working for more than 10 years. While you're doing activism, you're also doing project management, and you have been the UNESCO Young Delegate for the Paris Agreement, and since then you have participated and followed the international negotiation process under the UNFCCC. And in your 5th COP, you were chosen as one of the 50 Rising Stars by Tesco Group. And so it's really amazing how you have been able to make your activism from local to global as well. So I guess SSF is also focused mainly on education with courses and webinars and events in Argentina, but across Latin America as well, right? And I think well, we have heard from business leaders, politicians, and also some great experts so far. I'm now coming to you with the perspective of a young person and an environmental scientist. What do you think is happening in the 10 years that you have been part of this conversations and 5 years at COP? What do you think? Why aren't energy systems and policies moving faster than ever? And what is this impasse that's, here every COP we say that, things have not moved forward. Every year we say now we need more bolder and stronger climate action. And how does this affect young people? After all, we are the future of the planet, so what do you think?
Well, thank you very much. That's a very complicated question too, but I'm going to do my best. So first of all, thank you. Thank you, especially Extreme Hangout, for bringing such high-level speakers to this conversation, and especially Amber and everyone for doing this. My name is Nasha, as you said. I am from Argentina. A few weeks ago, I got really, really afraid, because now we have a new president elected. That president is a climate denier. As an activist, as a woman, as someone who worked from climate sciences, who saw what happened with NGOs and climate activists during the Trump presidency and the Bolsonaro presidency, because we also work a little bit really close with Brazil, with Colombia, with Costa Rica, with Chile, I was really afraid. And I had this question on my mind: why in democracy we have people, like a lot of people, more than 50% of the population in Argentina, voting for a climate denier? And more, why poor people are voting for a climate denier? Because poor people are the most affected, and we see that from the front line. We work with communities, as you always say, but for us, they live, 80% of the population of Latin America lives in urban areas. But let's say suburban areas, right? They are not cities like Dubai. They are cities where you have very poor infrastructure, where when you have a heat wave, they really suffer the heat wave. They don't have current water to drink. They can really go to hospital due to a heat wave. They don't have air conditioner to turn on. So why poor people voted for a climate denier? That's a question I have in my mind. And there are many reasons why, of course. In my country, we are suffering a very difficult economic crisis, and it seemed a solution, right? There are many reasons. But it says to all of us that we're climate activists, that climate action is not getting into people. Like energy is every day more expensive instead of less expensive. Small businesses, we worked with small shops that sell convenience stores. They cannot keep on all the fridge because it's too expensive. They cannot sell the product. They are really in economic crisis. So they don't see benefit from better household infrastructure. I'm going to tell you something. We worked with a community that work in a very complicated slum where there is a lot of violence, etc. And we start working with them, and they had solar panels. Who has solar panels at home here? There's anyone who has solar panels here at home? Yeah, great, great. So in my case too, I have a professional degree, right? And still, it was very, very complicated to understand which cable needs to be plugged with the other one, right? Even having a professional career. How do you expect someone that has a problem with a solar panel, that they don't know how to connect the cables correctly, to be part of the climate solution when they are not being benefited? A lot of people got solar panels, but they don't know how to use them. And at the same time, we were doing a consultation for UNDP and OIJ, which is another UN advocacy group for youth. And a main issue for youth is jobs. They are not getting prepared for the future, and they need jobs. And in Argentina, we have a lot of opportunities regarding solar, wind, biomass, etc. But only 15% of our electric, not energy, electric matrix is based on solar and wind. 15%. Why? So if you want a framework for business to establish, you need public support. To get public support, you need to benefit people. So people in the center, in our opinion, as an NGO that works not only in education, but also implementing projects, it's that people need to understand how climate change affects them and why energy transition, a just energy transition, can help them too. That will be something to add to the conversation.
That is absolutely a brilliant perspective. I think we've heard at the global level and at the policy level that we are doing all these things, but in the end, I think at the consumer level, if we don't understand what plug goes where, we will not be able to use that power for our benefit. And I think that's something that we really need to address. I'll go around the panel now with one more round of questions, but
can I pick up,
can we
Nasha?
go on that? Yes.
Really, really liked what you said there, because people on the ground have to feel the benefits. I mean, I think one of the single most important things that the G20 committed to over 10 years ago in 2009, but haven't delivered on, is the elimination of now what is $1.4 trillion of fossil fuel subsidies that basically keep us dependent on fossil fuels. So it's very difficult to realize the benefits of moving to the green economy when you've got 1.4 trillion keeping us using fossil fuels, right? Now, quite simply, they committed, and at every COP, they keep saying, yeah, we'll do it someday, but it never comes, right? So even though the fossil fuel industry is now making 4 trillion profit per year, where they were making 1 trillion, again, subsidies haven't gone down, right? So basically, you're finding that the more money they make, the less is being actually incentivized into green behavior. So that switch of just using carrots and sticks to get us onto a level playing field where the alternatives can compete. I mean, I led aviation. Kerosene is untaxed by Chicago Convention 1946. That hasn't been changed. So it's very difficult to compete with kerosene if you're sustainable aviation fuel or any of these alternatives. So it's just quite simple, switching the cash.
I'm not sure if I think it is that simple, actually. It's a controversial point, but a lot of reporting has gone into the subsidies for hydrocarbons. And again, I'll agree the simple point, hydrocarbons shouldn't be subsidized. But the biggest numbers that came through last year on government subsidies for hydrocarbons were because of cost of living crisis globally. So governments felt compelled to make it, reduce the cost to the consumer to get people through the last winter in Europe, for example, because people were exposed, because of the energy system we have today, to the super high commodity prices. So governments had to intervene. Okay, that, for me, is a real problem with short-term and long-term planning around the energy system. Because why did that have to happen? Because the energy system remains too reliant on the hydrocarbons and didn't have energy security built into it. So I think it's rational in some sense as well, reasonable, that those subsidies did happen here. At the same time, you need to taking Nash's point, think how to add other sources of energy to the system and make that accessible and feasible. So if I pick up on your solar point, I'm an energy specialist, I'm sophisticated in the space, and in any global standard, I'm very wealthy. But I find it incredibly difficult to understand how to retrofit my house, how to put solar in. As you say, it's a complicated thing to do. Accessing the economics is very difficult. So if you want to bring these two things together, you want more solar, you've got to create an environment where you can access that solar in a simple, easy, understandable way, in a way that reduces over the long term your energy cost and your exposure to hydrocarbons. So then there's an interaction, and Nasha made the point, you need policy to support it, You may need some kind of incentives as you roll out that kind of system, but you need to release yourself from a position where government finds itself having to intervene on energy costs because you've got a much more resilient and sustainable system. So I'd focus on things like consumer credit, consumer access to things like solar and batteries in order to unleash that cheaper baseload energy, which is typically distributed and therefore in the hands of individuals. But you can't do it just by switching off one side and the other. You've actually got to have a plan.
Yeah. Okay. I think that there is also an opportunity to shift the focus in some areas. For example, take transportation. There is a lot of focus on electric cars. In my country, people can't afford a car. Young people in my country don't drive. They simply don't drive, they take the bus. So if you want to engage young people, let's make the electric buses, the electric transportation, even the trains, let's connect our country again with trains, electric trains, what you can get with your bike and go to your job, etc. That even could benefit people from the quality of the air. Right now in Buenos Aires, there is really not that good quality in the air too. So there are a lot of ways to benefit people, and especially young people. But you need to shift the mind on where to put the focus if you want to engage them.
Yeah.
Indeed. Actually, that brings me to one question, because we talked about aviation a bit and transport. I'll come to you, Charles, actually, for my second question. You were able to help champion an entire sector, that to an energy-intensive one like aviation, to come together and commit to net zero. As far as I know, and from my own understanding working with the fashion industry much recently, there's so much competition within the sector and a lot of distrust. And it is a challenge to bring them together and have a collective voice. So could you please share some insights with us on how the industry, especially aviation, was able to come together for this momentum and initiative towards, the agreement, Paris Agreement? What worked, and can this happen beyond aviation? Can it happen in the ONG space? And maybe also how the energy transition happens on a global scale?
Yeah, thank you, Divya. I think it's when good people step up in whatever sector, right? So in aviation, no one really wanted to step up because the pandemic was on. Airlines were making people redundant. Initially, the instinct of a lot of the stakeholders when I approached them on the UNFCCC team 6 months out of what was COP26, which was delayed by a year, so it became an 18-month effort to try and get the aviation world on board with the race to zero. They were really not interested. And they're like, Charles, fair enough, but we've got better things to worry about than decarbonization. We're losing our businesses. We're letting people go. And then you occasionally come across, as I said, those individuals that step up in life, right? And then suddenly you had someone, not even a chief exec, but someone working for IAG, British Airways, who said, right, Charles, I understand what you're saying. Let's have a chat, see who else we can get on board. Someone from Heathrow, actually, Heathrow Airport, which was going through its own controversy around building a runway 3, and then the pandemic hit, so that was put on the shelf, and then they had, other challenges of just keeping the airport open. And he was like, I understand, this is going to be about long-term resilience for airports. Let's get on board. So you then start facilitating collaboration. As I said, when humans come together at scale, which 90,000 people here, great things can be achieved. We've seen some great announcements already. We can see a lot achieved by the end of this period if the positive energy comes together in what I call radical collaboration. That we stop blaming each other and we actually start to motivate towards solving the solutions together. In history, there's so many examples. Putting a man on the moon by 10 years, did it in 8 years. Civil rights movement, equality for all, suffragettes, women's vote, anti-apartheid movement. There's so many movements that demonstrate that humans can do this, right? And that's why I've been inspired by movements. This movement is really called the sustainability revolution. You can use different language for it, but that's the language that we termed at the inconvenient truth days of setting up climate reality. When I did the training with Al Gore in 2007, we called this the sustainability revolution. So, if you imagine critical mass of people all engaged with solutions around the sustainability revolution, we can do it. We did it with aviation. That was a really hard job, but that's just the beginning of the journey. Now they've got to work out how to make sustainable aviation fuel economic versus kerosene, as I mentioned, and bring in electric, hydrogen, hybrid aircraft, which it's happening, Zero Avia, Airbus, etc., is clean, silent aircraft. What better could there be than clean, silent aircraft for the future, which we have already. We just need to scale it and get trillions of dollars to support the green sustainability revolution.
Great, thank you. I guess my next question will be a little bit combined. Probably I would request Chris and Rob to address this, but it basically focuses on the technology transfer and the knowledge transfer that's needed to happen from global north to global south. The UK has shown massive leadership in leading the way forward for the mission net zero. And similarly, I think the Energy Transitions Council is working extensively on and ensuring that the global south does not get left behind in the energy transition. So what are some of the initiatives and what are the kind of things that need to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, especially as a part of the energy transition, that the global north and global south can work together on?
So, I mean, I find sometimes it quite frustrating, the sort of false divide between a global south and a global north, when we recognize the complexity of global supply chains mean that, a company's scope sort of 3 emissions potentially is another company in the global south scope 1 emissions. So we are highly interconnected, and sort of recognizing that there's not a simple divide. I think also there is this other challenge about how to have a united purpose. We've talked about sort of fossil fuel vested interests, and they've only got one thing to do, which is defend the status quo. The challenge we have in a climate movement is how to ensure that we all move in the same direction and don't fall out amongst ourselves. I do caution sometimes against creating sort of false narratives that create divides that aren't there. And the challenge is that in the global south, there are some countries that are already committed in the past to sort of coal energy production. And it's right that we sort of focus on getting off coal for those specific economies, and recognize that they will hit peak coal, and we need to then work with them, and also understand they're growing economies, their populations are growing, they've got to be provided with a quality of life that is fit for a modern economy. These same narratives that we have in our own countries around net zero make us poorer and colder, or it's going to sort of lead to degrowth. Those are narratives that will also emerge in the global south, or these countries that want to develop as the developing nations. I don't think that term's particularly an accurate one. But there are also those countries that aren't on the, aren't using fossil fuels. They're burning wood. So they have an opportunity to move straight to renewables. But we've got to make it their opportunity. It comes back to that question of ownership I talked about earlier. It's their transition. They should see the benefit of it. And as was mentioned, it should be their jobs. The worst thing that could happen, I can see it happening here, is we've got countries coming with their own energy transition plans worth tens of billions of pounds, and we have companies lining up to meet them to help them deliver on their transition. But this will be nothing short of green colonialism if we don't ensure that these countries seek the benefits, the equity benefits, as well as the energy benefits that can be returned on the back of a transition. There are many countries that are very rich in natural resources that are relevant for the energy transition. Let's make sure that they benefit and see directly the economic benefits in their own pockets as a result. Otherwise, we are just reaping what we sow, and we will make the same mistakes that we've made in the past.
Thank you.
I'm going to disagree with something that Chris has said, I'm afraid.
That's what we want.
So it's kind of the thing now. You can applaud the UK for its leadership, arguably, on green and lower carbon. But you need to acknowledge a few things about where the UK sits. It's post-industrial, it's incredibly wealthy, it's got a big endowment of wind, and it's got a massive grid. So of course the UK should and can decarbonise very quickly, and well done, and that's all great. So any carbon is lower. But you've got a situation, the global south-north is really well illustrated by the UK's leadership, if you like, or positioning itself around leadership on the energy transition in that sense, because what they're doing in the UK economy is good, but the industrial base of the UK has effectively shifted to high-carbon industrial production in the global south. So if you ask the question about what has to happen to deliver not only an energy transition globally, but a just transition which is shared between North and South economies, you have to be putting money into your supply chain and working with your supply chain and then funding that supply chain by committing to lower carbon production, by enabling that supply chain to build out a renewables or a low carbon base in their production base to supply that richer northern economy, okay? So I think there needs to be a little bit of honesty around the difference between north and south, and to then look at how the transition itself actually gets delivered.
Yeah.
The other point I'd make is that some of the proselytizing from those sort of more advanced nations in terms of what can be done is possibly misplaced when you try and apply a solution that works in one economy to another economy. So again, the UK, big grid, lots of wind, you can actually close coal and grow wind. Mm-hmm. And you can deliver those new electrons around an existing grid. Okay, great. Could you apply the same thing to a country in West Africa that doesn't have a big grid, doesn't have that endowment of wind? How are you going to do it? So you need then to work with local distributed energy. You need a different energy transition solution in that economy. So I think you need to combine buying, how you buy and how you fund your supply chain, recognize you want that supply chain to be low carbon and not have the conceit that because you've got consumption in a low carbon economy, you've automatically decarbonized. So I'm not saying you're conceited, but I think you need a balanced view around making sure that you are funding the transition through your purchasing and through your work with the supply chain between those different economies.
Indeed. And I think that actually brings me to Nasha again, talking about your youth perspective of the just transition in the global south, and what do you think are some of the important things that need to happen in that shift? And then I think it's also like, companies that are part of that, supply chain and things like that. What do you see the future should look like for the global south? You share that.
Thank you. I think that maybe it would be a good idea to fund all those places where you feel you have a hope. And to be totally honest, I do not find hope in men that travel in private jets. And I really, really find hope, especially in young women leading in Latin America, because it's the region I know, like in Colombia, in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, in all of these countries. They're really shaping their communities, they're really learning, bringing people together, and I really find opportunities and hope there. So let's bring also investment on theirs, because every pound you put on them, it becomes a new community that has democratized energy, or that they have created jobs for their kids or youngsters. So let's fund them. And we are from the third sector, from the third world, as sometimes we say, so we really know about resilience. We have been here as NGOs and as activists among the different governments, among different situations, so we are going to still going on.
Amazing. So I think the common theme that has come out is local authorities championing, local communities and local leaders and business leaders championing. And of course, people who are in the energy transition space, experts who are able to then, kind of bring this across, not just for UK, not just for one country, but take it as a solution for the entire planet. So thank you for that amazing perspectives. I think we have very little time.
Do we have a couple of minutes?
Just wanted to check.
Couple of minutes?
Couple minutes, yeah. We take questions from the audience. 10
Okay,
minutes?
great.
Yeah.
Can I just come in on that? Because I think you summed it up well, and just building on Nasha's point. I mean, I think it is when people do the right thing. So we talked about those different levels of leadership, but it has to be about doing the right thing, right? I think we all know what the difference between when I say the right thing on this agenda and the wrong thing is, right? I mean, clearly we cannot go on burning 1.5 million years worth of fossilized matter every week. It's just ridiculous, unsustainable, right? So there's an ethical question in here as well. When it comes to, in case studies in history, like with smoking in the UK, suddenly smoking became socially unacceptable in public places, right? Just overnight, boom. Now you wouldn't light up in a restaurant or a bar or a nightclub in England with a cigarette. It just is, you would be totally frowned upon. It's just unacceptable, right? Similarly, it becomes unacceptable to be carrying on with irresponsible behavior when we know, sitting right here, beautiful day, but 29 degrees in the middle of winter, right? I mean, that just is so obvious that we've got such a big problem on our hands. We all have to step up and do the right thing. Now, the last time we had such a massive challenge in terms of change of era was actually in the 1800s. We talked about Britain playing a leadership role. I mean, Britain's done a lot of bad things, but don't forget, pioneering the Industrial Revolution came after a really dark period of human slavery. So the abolitionists in the House of Commons, led by William Wilberforce and others in the early 1800s, they had to make the argument to the British East India Company and other incumbents of the day that there was a moral question, because slavery was taken for granted in the 1700s and before. In the agricultural revolution, animals and humans was the power source for agricultural produce, right? Then we replaced that, obviously, with the Industrial Revolution in terms of machinery. Okay. Now we've got the problem where we need to replace the Industrial Revolution with the sustainability revolution. And at this point, it's like, well, how do you bring that era to an end? They had to bring in the abolitionists and say, we're now abolishing slavery in 1833. William Wilberforce didn't actually see the Abolitionist Act go through the House of Commons because he died a month before, but his whole life's work with the abolitionists was to abolish slavery in the UK. Now, in the US, they decided, yeah, we don't really like that so much. We'd rather go to war over it. And they had 7 years of civil war over whether or not to abolish slavery. So I guess my point is the politics of division, you mentioned it earlier, right? Some cynical politicians will divide us in the movement of trying to do the right thing. And I think we need to rise above that as humans, not listen to the cynical voices, come together, and we can move beyond being stuck on the dependence on fossil fuels. Like once upon a time, they were stuck on cigarettes. Before that, they were stuck on, unfortunately, a dependence on human people in the slavery era.
Yeah, and I see the sustainability revolution happening here right now in Dubai, and each one in this room is a champion, is doing the right thing. I believe that's the story of hope for all of us. Okay, any questions from the crowd? Yeah, please.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for bringing together such diverse perspectives. I really want to follow up on a point that you made, Chris, about bringing the energy transition to local communities. I'm from Norway, and we recently had a Supreme Court decision that basically deemed the biggest onshore wind park in the world to be unconstitutional because it breaches the indigenous rights of the Sami population because their reindeer is heard in that same area. We also had a great talk yesterday by the CEO of CEPSA, who said that it takes me about 2 weeks to build charging points. It's going to take me several years to get all the permissions and approvals from all the local communities with the infrastructure that we actually need to build tomorrow's energy system. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we overcome some of those challenges with actually involving local communities.
So I think the point here, I guess, is the role of legislation and regulation in order to create a big bang sort of moment. This question around how do you own ownership in the same way how the City of London had this big bang moment and opened up share ownership to people. I think that's similar with net zero. At the moment, and it's not the case in every country, community energy is being sort of constrained by a lack of not just sort of legislative sort of framework, but also the planning system. And we have basically a planning system that's sort of not fit for a net zero world. A lot of the things that we have put in place need to be revisited and updated. And updating those frameworks to allow this acceleration to take place is going to be absolutely vital. The net zero review I took forward not only identified opportunities, but the blockages, the debris on the tracks, as I used to call it in the round tables, that says, this is what is stopping people from delivering ambition further and faster. And some of those are national pieces of legislation. There are others that are international. One thing that I still hope might happen at COP28 is that the UK government will commit to leaving the Energy Charter Treaty that has also stopped the Netherlands and Italy from building out renewable infrastructure projects because they've threatened them using this legislation that was put in place to protect Eastern European gas reserves back in the 1990s. So we almost need this audit, this sort of ability to look at the world as it existed, and to borrow Charles's sort of language around a sustainable revolution, to recognise that the future is different, and that we have a world that existed that is no longer going to be there, but we've got to be able to update our legislation and regulation in order to provide that opportunity. And then when it just comes to consent, community consent, I just think we should look at what is happening around the world and not reinvent the wheel. There are certain countries that are doing some great stuff on community consent. You know, Italy offers a share of turnover to local communities if they have, you know, energy projects built in their backyard. You know, how can we get, you know, turn NIMBYs into YIMBYs, not in my backyard, into yes into my backyard? And there are some great community energy projects that are already being established. And actually the one onshore wind turbine that was built in England, compared to the 18 that have been built in Ukraine since the start of the war, goes to show the challenge we're facing when it comes to planning regulation. It was actually a community energy project, Ambition and Energy in Lawrence Weston. And what they've done is to recognize this one turbine is going to bring down the bills in a local council estate. And everyone's in support of it because they can see it's not just an environmental objective, there's an economic one too.
To a stage where it's impossible to do building consent or any kind of planning consent or any industrial process without making a primary question the energy impact of what's happening. I would call out, I'm sorry to have another UK example, but you've got British members on the panel, King's College, Cambridge. If anyone knows the building, it's one of the most famous buildings in the world. It's a stunning medieval building. It's almost untouched since it was built by the Tudors. They've just covered the roof with solar panels. Yeah. And that is a completely radical shift in how to think about, you know, developing out our communities and our built infrastructure. Green can be beautiful, and we need to say we don't want that roof to be looking like it was when it was built in whatever it is, the 1500s. We want that roof to be covered in solar panels. Yeah. The UK has led the world, I'm told, on national parks. The average energy efficiency of a building in a UK national park is 40% below the energy efficiency of the UK average, because we insist on a certain kind of roof. We insist on a certain kind of building material. You have to make the energy planning prime in how you're building out. You might make exceptions, and there are always going to be exceptions to these rules, but you've got to basically have regulation and legislation saying getting the efficiency into the economy is the primary driver.
Thank you. Thank you for the UK example, but of course that can be replicated anywhere and really is a best practice for the world to take. So, thank you. Any other questions?
I would like to highlight about another case. Sorry. Just,
no, you can go ahead and then we'll go.
Very quickly, like in Argentina, we also have this problem with the lithium, in which there was a huge province that actually changed the constitution to kick off indigenous people that were living there, to exploit lithium with private companies from other countries to make batteries, other offshores, to sell it to Europe. So when we talk about just transition, we also need to understand what are you pushing in non-developed countries, in which conditions, and that is also part of how you work and you build communications and community level for just transition.
Absolutely. I think it all boils down to the fact that our common needs are the same. We're all looking for the same energy needs. How we get them is the challenge. It could be different geography, and how we work on the solution might look different, but the idea is that the more the solutions can be taken from different parts of the world and replicated, and a success story is really what is the key to, you know, making that energy transition faster, and including policy, of course, understanding how policies work in the UK, in Europe, and other parts of the world, and how they can also be further replicated in different you know, countries in the global south, and truly taking that knowledge and the technology to the right communities and the right people with the right champions in businesses and everywhere else. So with that, I'd like to...
Was there one more question?
There's one more question? Yeah? Okay.
This lady, and the lady there maybe as well. Yeah. Oh, we're running out of time, okay.
Hi, I'm Ingrid from Sweden, and I live in Stockholm archipelago, and there is a big conflict about wind power at the sea and the people living there, because they don't want to see it, or at least not even see it with binoculars. But just across the sea we have an island called Åland. It belongs to Finland, and there is also a magnificent archipelago, but there they're putting up windmills a lot, because the people in Åland get money from them. So it's the same example.
Yeah.
Well, you raise the point about incentivization, right? Because there's so-called perverse incentives, and then there's healthy incentives. And I think, humans are quite stubborn. I mean, if you think of, dare I say it, I mean, we're also quite adaptive, but we can be stubborn. And we had a great saying when I grew up, say, adapt or die, because that's really the human success story. You have to adapt. But we go into our sort of indulgences where we don't want to change. We're creatures of habit as well. I picture a sort of donkey. You kind of need a carrot on the one hand, a stick on the other hand to get humanity as a whole to shift. And that's why I go back to this point about the right incentives. It's actually not that difficult. If you take the principle that, again, Al Gore, we have to mention him again, he's been championing for so long. The polluter must pay, because why not? The externality of pollution is a cost to society and the environment of the fossil fuel companies making a lot of money in going about their business, right? So why not capture revenues like they did in Norway, another Scandinavian example there, capture the revenues on the back of rich hydrocarbons, create a fund like the sovereign fund, and then you incentivize the right behavior from the polluter pays principle. If we start doing that all over the world, I mean, it's a bit like my example on removing the $1.4 trillion supporting subsidies for fossil fuels. It's really easy. We had the feed-in tariff for solar in the UK. People started putting solar on their roofs. Of course, in 2012, we had cut the green crap from Prime Minister David Cameron, unfortunately. Al Gore called him out about that publicly, although he said he didn't like to get involved in domestic affairs of another nation, but he was visiting the UK at the time, and he said, Prime Minister, what are you doing? Cutting the green crap when this is the moment we need to incentivize green behavior. A lot of us were looking into solar panels, and suddenly, overnight, the solar industry collapsed. So I just think the right incentives, doing too many wind farms in areas of outstanding natural beauty, that's, again, the wrong incentives, right? So it's got to just be cleverly thought through, the carrots and the sticks.
Brilliant. Thank you. Any last words as well from any of the panelists?
No, just to say thanks very much for attending. It's been a great discussion and some great questions. And I think the big challenge is obviously how we can share the opportunities and the ideas that every country is working on, and we don't duplicate this. We've got this one chance. Let's not make sure this transition doesn't end up like the electricity transition with 14 different types of plugs around the world.
Yeah.
We've got more in common. We live under the same climate. Let's make sure the transition is also one we can have in common as well.
Absolutely, a single just energy transition for the world. Thank you very much for all the panelists for the kind time. Nasha, you have any last words? Yeah?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Divya, for being such a great moderator, and again to the Extreme Hangout team.
Yes, thank you very much to Amber and Teresa and team, and thank you everyone for joining us today.